You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. But one morning last spring, a young woman walked into my courtroom who reminded me why I still put on these robes every single day, what she had done for her grandmother, what she sacrificed without asking for anything in return. It brought tears to my eyes right there on the bench. And when I finally delivered my verdict, when I told her what I had decided, I watched as she broke down crying. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about love, sacrifice, and what real character looks like when nobody's watching. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a municipal court judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years now. Every morning I wake up at 6:15, make my coffee strong and black, kiss my wife Joyce goodbye, and drive the same route I've driven since 1984. I get to the courthouse at 8:15 sharp. My clerk, Christina, always has the case files ready on my desk, organized exactly the way I like them. She knows me better than I know myself sometimes after all these years working together. My father came to this country from Italy with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. He worked construction his entire life, breaking his back so his children could have opportunities he never had. He used to tell me every morning before he left for work, he'd put his hand on my shoulder and say, "Francesco, always remember that how you treat people when they're down tells the world who you really are." Those words have guided every decision I've made from this bench, every single one. I learned early in my career that this job isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about seeing people, really seeing them, understanding that behind every citation, every ticket, every violation, there's a human being with a story, someone's mother, someone's son, someone who's struggling in ways I might never fully understand. That's what keeps me coming back day after day, year after year, the chance to make a difference in someone's life, even if it's just for a few minutes in my courtroom. That particular morning, it was a Tuesday in April. I remember because it was the week after Easter, and my wife had just taken down all the decorations from our house. I got to the courthouse, and Christina greeted me with her usual smile. She handed me my coffee and said, "Judge, we've got a full docket today. 23 cases." I looked through the files as I always do, reading each one carefully, trying to understand the situation before I ever see the person standing before me. Something felt different that morning, though. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly. Maybe it was the warm spring air coming through the courthouse windows. Maybe it was just one of those days when you wake up feeling grateful to be alive. Whatever it was, I felt ready to listen, ready to do what was right. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into my courtroom. I saw the usual faces in the gallery, some people I recognized from previous cases, some lawyers I'd worked with for years, some nervous defendants clutching papers, fidgeting in their seats. I took my place on the bench, looked out at everyone gathered there, and said what I say every morning. "Good morning, everyone. Let's begin." Christina called the first few cases, standard stuff mostly, parking violations, a speeding ticket, a young man who had let his registration expire. I listened to each person's story, asked my questions, made my rulings, fair but firm. That's always been my approach. I'm not here to destroy people's lives over minor infractions. I'm here to uphold the law, yes, but also to understand context, to see the whole picture. Around 10:30, Christina called a name that caught my attention. She said, "Case number 4273, Sarah Mitchell, parking in a handicapped zone without proper permits." I looked up from my papers and watched as a young woman stood up from the back row. She couldn't have been more than 24 or 25 years old. I noticed immediately how tired she looked. Not just physically tired, but the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into your bones when you've been carrying a heavy burden for too long. She walked to the front of my courtroom with her head down, clutching a manila envelope in both hands. Her clothes were clean, but worn. I could see she had tried to dress nicely for court, wearing a simple dress that looked like it had seen better days. Her shoes were scuffed. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that looked like it had been done in a hurry, but what struck me most were her eyes. When she finally looked up at me, I saw something in those eyes that I recognized. I saw determination mixed with fear. I saw someone who was fighting a battle that nobody else could see. I said to her, keeping my voice gentle, "Miss Mitchell, you're here today because you received a citation for parking in a handicapped zone without the proper permit. Is that correct?" She nodded, and I saw her swallow hard before she spoke. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I could tell she was nervous, so I smiled at her. I wanted her to know that I wasn't her enemy. I was here to listen. I leaned forward a little bit and said, "Tell me what happened. Help me understand the situation." And that's when her story began to unfold. That's when I started to understand exactly what this young woman had been dealing with and why she was standing in my courtroom that morning. She took a deep breath, and I watched as she tried to compose herself. She said, "Your Honor, I know I was wrong to park there. I know there are no excuses, but I need you to understand what was happening that day." I could hear the tremor in her voice. I could see she was fighting back tears. I nodded at her and said, "Go ahead. I'm listening. Take your time." She told me that she lives with her grandmother, has lived with her since she was 16 years old, when her own mother passed away from cancer. Her grandmother, whose name was Rose, had raised her, put her through school, given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. I felt my heart soften immediately. I understood something about family obligation, about loyalty, about the bond between generations. My own grandmother had been my world when I was a boy. Miss Mitchell continued her story, and I listened to every word. She explained that 6 months ago, her grandmother had suffered a massive stroke. I watched her face as she described finding her grandmother collapsed on the kitchen floor one morning. The fear she must have felt, the panic. She told me how she had called 911, ridden in the ambulance, sat in the emergency room for hours, not knowing if her grandmother would survive. Her grandmother did survive, she told me, but the stroke had left her partially paralyzed and unable to care for herself. I saw tears forming in her eyes as she described the woman who had raised her, who had been so strong and independent, now unable to dress herself, to feed herself, to use the bathroom without assistance. The roles had reversed completely. The grandmother who had cared for her was now the one who needed care. I asked her, "Where is your grandmother now?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said, "She's at home, Your Honor, with me. I take care of her full time." I watched as she opened the manila envelope she'd been holding and pulled out a stack of papers. She handed them to Christina, who brought them up to me. Medical records, hospital bills, prescriptions, physical therapy schedules, the documentation of someone's entire medical crisis right there in my hands. I looked through the papers carefully. I saw the diagnosis, ischemic stroke with right side paralysis. I saw the list of medications, at least 12 different prescriptions. I saw the bills, and my eyes widened at the numbers, tens of thousands of dollars. I looked up at her and said, "Your insurance covered this?" She shook her head. "No, Your Honor, my grandmother doesn't have insurance. She's not old enough for Medicare yet, and she couldn't afford private insurance on her fixed income. We're paying out of pocket. We set up a payment plan with the hospital." Something twisted in my chest when I heard that. Here was this young woman, barely out of college age, suddenly responsible for crushing medical debt that she had no way to pay. I said to her, "What about you? Are you working?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor, I work 2 jobs. I'm a waitress at a diner during the day, and I clean offices at night. I do both because I need the money for Grandma's care and our bills." Now, let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who just takes your breath away with their selflessness? Someone who's sacrificing everything for another person without complaint? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're moved by what you're hearing, if Sarah's story is touching your heart like it touched mine, hit that like button for me. I sat back in my chair and looked at this young woman standing before me. I thought about my own children, my grandchildren. I wondered if they would do the same for me if I needed them. I hoped they would, but I honestly didn't know. And here was this girl, this young woman barely starting her own life, putting everything on hold to care for the woman who raised her. I felt something stirring in my chest. Respect, admiration, a deep appreciation for the kind of character that doesn't come along very often. I said to her, "Tell me about the day you got this ticket. Walk me through what happened." She nodded and took another deep breath. "It was 3 weeks ago, Your Honor. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I had just finished my shift at the diner at 2 o'clock. I needed to get Grandma to a doctor's appointment at 2:30. Her neurologist is across town, and we don't have a car. We take the bus usually, but that day she was having a really bad day." I watched her face as she continued. She said, "Sometimes Grandma has good days where she can move a little bit, where she's alert and can communicate, but other days, the bad days, she can barely stay conscious. She gets confused. She doesn't recognize me. That Wednesday was one of the worst days I'd seen since she came home from the hospital. I knew I couldn't get her on the bus. I just knew she wouldn't make it." "So what did you do?" I asked. She looked down at her hands. "I called a cab, Your Honor. I spent $40 we didn't have on a cab ride to get her to that appointment. When we got there, I was trying to get her out of the car and into the wheelchair I'd borrowed from a neighbor. She's not a small woman and I'm not very strong. It took me almost 10 minutes just to get her into that chair." I could picture the scene she was describing. This young woman struggling with her grandmother's weight, probably embarrassed, definitely exhausted, racing against time to make a doctor's appointment. She continued her story. The only open spot near the entrance was a handicapped space. I looked around for regular parking, but everything was full. The parking lot was packed. I knew if I parked far away, I'd never get Grandma all the way to the office in time. She was already getting agitated. She was confused and upset. "So I made a decision," she said, and I could hear the guilt in her voice. "I parked in that handicapped spot. I told myself it would just be for a minute, just long enough to get Grandma inside and checked in, and then I'd move the car. I swear, Your Honor, that was my plan. Just a few minutes. I wasn't trying to break the law. I wasn't trying to take advantage. I just needed to get my grandmother to her doctor." "What happened next?" I asked. She looked up at me with those tired eyes. "The appointment took longer than I expected. The doctor was running behind. By the time we were done, by the time I got Grandma back to the waiting room and went outside to move the car, there was already a ticket on my windshield. $250. She paused, and I saw a tear roll down her cheek. $250 that I don't have, that I can't pay, not with everything else we're dealing with. I looked down at the citation in front of me. Sure enough, $250. I'd seen these tickets 1,000 times. They're designed to be expensive, to deter people from abusing handicapped parking. And they should be expensive. Those spots exist for a reason. They exist for people who genuinely need them. But as I sat there looking at this young woman, listening to her story, I had to ask myself the hard question. Was this really abuse, or was this desperation? I said to her, "Miss Mitchell, I need to ask you something. Why didn't your grandmother qualify for a handicapped permit? If she's paralyzed from a stroke, she should be eligible." She nodded immediately. "She does qualify, Your Honor. I applied for the permit the week after she got home from the hospital, but there's a backlog. The DMV told me it could take 6 to 8 weeks to process. I've been waiting for 5 weeks now. It should come any day." I felt my jaw tighten. 6 to 8 weeks. For someone who clearly, obviously, desperately needs that permit right now, not in 6 weeks, right now. This was one of those moments when bureaucracy fails people, when the system doesn't account for human need. I've seen it too many times. I've railed against it too many times, and yet it keeps happening. I asked her, "Do you have documentation of your application?" She nodded quickly and reached back into her manila envelope. She pulled out a paper and handed it to Christina. It was a receipt from the DMV, dated 5 weeks prior, showing that Sarah Mitchell had applied for a handicapped placard on behalf of Rose Mitchell. Everything was in order. Everything was proper. She had done exactly what she was supposed to do. I looked at that receipt for a long moment, Then I looked back up at her. I said, Miss Mitchell, let me make sure I understand your situation completely. You're working 2 jobs to support yourself and your grandmother. You're providing full-time care for a stroke victim. You're dealing with enormous medical bills. You applied for a handicapped permit through the proper channels. And on the day in question, you parked in that spot out of genuine medical necessity, not convenience. Is that accurate? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. That's exactly right. I could see the hope starting to build in her eyes. She was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, I was actually listening to her, that maybe I understood. I picked up the papers she'd given me and looked through them again. The medical records were extensive. The bills were staggering. The prescriptions were endless. This wasn't someone making excuses. This wasn't someone trying to get out of a ticket because they were lazy or entitled. This was someone drowning in circumstances beyond her control, trying to do the right thing with limited resources. I thought about my father in that moment. I thought about what he would say if he were sitting next to me. I could almost hear his voice in my ear. Francesco, he'd say, this is not a criminal. This is a good person in a bad situation. Use your head, use your heart, do what's right. I set the papers down and looked at Sarah Mitchell. I said, how is your grandmother doing now? How's her recovery going? I saw her face change slightly. A mix of sadness and resignation crossed her features. She's not really recovering, Your Honor, she said quietly. The doctors say this is probably as good as it's going to get. We're just trying to maintain her quality of life, trying to keep her comfortable, trying to make sure she knows she's loved. That hit me hard. I felt it right in my chest. This young woman had already accepted that her grandmother wasn't going to get better, that this was her life now, caring for someone with no hope of improvement, no light at the end of the tunnel, just day after day of helping someone eat, helping someone bathe, helping someone maintain their dignity in the face of a body that had betrayed them. I said to her, and I made sure my voice was gentle, does your grandmother know you're here today? Does she know about this ticket? Sarah shook her head. No, Your Honor. I didn't tell her. She worries about me enough already. She feels guilty that I'm taking care of her. She apologizes to me constantly for being a burden. She's not a burden, but she thinks she is. I didn't want to add to her stress. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. If you've ever felt that deep respect for someone's character, for someone's sacrifice, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me. And make sure you're subscribed, because what I decided to do next, what I told this young woman, you need to hear. I took off my glasses and rubbed my eyes. I do that sometimes when I'm thinking, when I'm trying to make sense of a complicated situation. The law was clear. She had parked in a handicapped zone without a permit. Technically, she had violated the ordinance, but the spirit of the law, the reason that law exists, is to protect people with disabilities, to ensure they have access to the resources they need. And wasn't that exactly what Sarah was trying to do? Wasn't she trying to ensure her disabled grandmother had access to medical care? I put my glasses back on and looked directly at her. I said, Miss Mitchell, I want to tell you something. I've been doing this job for 40 years. I've seen thousands of people come through this courtroom. Some of them are good people who made mistakes. Some of them are just trying to work the system. But every once in a while, every once in a great while, I meet someone who restores my faith in humanity. Someone who reminds me why character matters more than anything else in this world. I watched as her eyes widened. She wasn't sure where I was going with this. Neither was anyone else in the courtroom. I could feel the attention of every person in that room focused on what I was about to say. I continued. You are one of those people, Miss Mitchell. What you're doing for your grandmother, the sacrifice you're making, it's extraordinary. You're 24 years old. You should be out living your life, building your career, maybe thinking about starting a family of your own someday. Instead, you're working 2 jobs and spending every other moment caring for someone who can't care for themselves. You're not complaining. You're not looking for recognition. You're just doing what you believe is right. I saw tears streaming down her face now. She was crying silently, her shoulders shaking slightly. I felt my own eyes getting moist. I'm not ashamed to admit it. This is what happens when you witness real goodness in a world that often feels short on it. I picked up my gavel, but I didn't bang it yet. I said, "The law says you violated an ordinance, and technically you did, but the law was created to serve people, not to punish them for acts of love and desperation. Your grandmother needed medical care. You got her to that care using the only means available to you. You've applied for the proper permit through the proper channels. You've done everything right except for this one moment of necessity." I paused and looked around my courtroom. I saw Christina wiping her eyes with a tissue. I saw several people in the gallery nodding their heads. I saw a young lawyer in the front row lean forward, waiting to hear what I would say next. I looked back at Sarah and said, "I'm not going to fine you today, Miss Mitchell. I'm dismissing this case. Case dismissed." And I brought the gavel down firmly. The relief that washed over her face was immediate and profound. She covered her mouth with both hands and just stood there crying. Not sad tears anymore. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of being seen and understood. She whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor. Oh my God, thank you so much." But I wasn't done yet. I held up my hand and said, "Wait, before you go, I want to give you something." I reached into my desk drawer where I keep my wallet. I pulled out $300 bills. It was the cash I'd taken out earlier that week for some household expenses. I looked at it for just a second, then looked back at Sarah. I said, "Christina, please give this to Miss Mitchell." Christina looked at me with wide eyes. She knew I did this sometimes, but not often. Only in the most deserving cases. She took the money and walked down to Sarah, placing it in her hands. Sarah looked down at the cash and then back up at me in complete shock. "Your Honor, I can't," she started to say. I interrupted her. "Yes, you can. That's for your grandmother's care. Buy her medication. Get her something nice. Take a cab to her next appointment instead of struggling with the bus. You've earned it through your character. Now, before I continue with what happened next, let me stop here and ask you something. Do you think I made the right call? Should I have dismissed her case, or should the law be enforced without exception, regardless of circumstances? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Leave me a comment because I read every single one. And if you believe compassion has a place in our justice system, hit that subscribe button right now. Sarah was sobbing openly now, still standing there, holding the money like she couldn't believe it was real. She said through her tears, "Your Honor, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank you. Nobody has been this kind to us in months. Not since Grandma got sick. Everyone has been so focused on rules and policies and what we owe. Nobody has asked what we need. Until today. Until you." I felt a lump forming in my throat. I said to her, "You don't need to thank me. You thank me by continuing to be the person you are, by continuing to take care of your grandmother with the same love and dedication you've shown, by remembering that kindness matters, that character matters, that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when nobody's watching, that's what makes you who you are." She nodded, still crying, and said, "I will, Your Honor. I promise I will." "Can I tell my grandmother about this? About what you did?" I smiled at her. "Yes, you tell her. You tell her that there are still people in this world who see goodness when it's right in front of them. You tell her that her granddaughter is one of the finest people I've ever had the privilege of meeting in my courtroom." Sarah gathered her papers, clutched the money I'd given her, and slowly walked toward the exit. But before she left, she turned back to look at me one more time. She placed her hand over her heart and mouthed the words, "Thank you," again. Then she was gone, and my courtroom felt somehow emptier without her presence. I sat there for a moment in silence. The entire courtroom was quiet. I heard someone in the gallery sniffle. I saw Christina dabbing at her eyes with another tissue. Even the police officer standing by the door looked moved. That's the power of witnessing true character. It affects everyone who sees it. I took a deep breath and said, "Next case." We had to move on. There were 20 more people waiting for their turn before me, but I'll tell you something honest. For the rest of that morning, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Mitchell. I couldn't stop thinking about what she was going home to. The daily challenge of caring for someone who couldn't care for themselves. The exhaustion that must follow her everywhere. The financial stress that must keep her awake at night. During my lunch break, I didn't eat. I sat in my chambers and I thought about my own grandmother. She had died when I was 19 years old. Cancer took her quickly, mercifully. We didn't have to watch her suffer for months or years. We didn't have to make the choice between our own lives and her care. And if we had, would I have done what Sarah was doing? Would I have been strong enough, selfless enough, loving enough? I wanted to think I would have been, but honestly, I didn't know. That's what made Sarah so remarkable. She wasn't asking herself those questions. She wasn't debating whether to do the right thing. She was just doing it, day after day, without recognition, without reward, without complaint. Around 1:30 that afternoon, Christina knocked on my door. She poked her head in and said, "Judge, you okay? You've been quiet." I nodded. "I'm fine, Christina, just thinking." She came in and sat down across from my desk. "That was something else, what you did this morning," she said. "That girl, Sarah. I've never seen anyone look so relieved in my life." I looked at Christina, who had been with me for 22 years. She knew me well. She knew when something was weighing on me. I said, "You know what gets me, Christina? We see people abuse the system every day. People who lie, who make excuses, who try to manipulate their way out of consequences. And then someone like Sarah walks in, someone genuinely deserving, and she's not even asking for help. She's ready to accept responsibility. She's ready to find a way to pay a fine she can't afford. That's character." Christina nodded. "You did the right thing, Judge. If anyone deserved compassion today, it was her." "I know," I said. "I just wish I could do more. $300 isn't going to solve her problems. It's not going to make her grandmother better. It's not going to give her back the life she should be living at 24 years old." "I know," Christina said softly, "but it's something, and sometimes something is enough to keep someone going." She was right, of course. Sometimes a small act of kindness, a moment of recognition, that's enough to remind someone that they're not alone, that someone sees their struggle, that their sacrifice matters. I hoped that's what I'd given Sarah that morning, not just dismissing a ticket and handing her some cash, but recognition, validation, acknowledgement of her character. That afternoon I went back to my courtroom and finished the docket. More parking tickets, a couple of noise violations, a young man who'd been caught with an open container. Routine stuff, but I'll be honest with you, my heart wasn't fully in it. Part of me was still with Sarah, wondering how her grandmother was doing, hoping they were okay. When I got home that evening, Joyce knew immediately that something was on my mind. After 48 years of marriage, she can read me like a book. She said, "Bad day?" I shook my head. "No, actually a good day. But it's making me think." We sat down at the kitchen table and I told her about Sarah, about her grandmother, about the decision I'd made. Joyce listened the way she always does, with her full attention, with empathy in her eyes. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. She said, "You're a good man, Frank. That's why I married you. That's why you're still doing this job after everyone else your age has retired. You still believe you can make a difference." I smiled at her. "Do you think I can make a difference?" She squeezed my hand. "You made a difference in that girl's life today. You made a difference in her grandmother's life, even if you never meet her. That's what matters." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the people like Sarah out there. People struggling in silence. People making enormous sacrifices that nobody sees or acknowledges. People who fall through the cracks of a system that isn't designed for their specific circumstances. How many of them were giving up because nobody cared? How many of them were drowning because the rules didn't allow for exceptions? Look, I need to ask you for a favor. If this story is resonating with you, if you're getting something out of it, hit that subscribe button for me. It helps me share these lessons with more people who need to hear them, and leave a comment telling me about a time someone showed you compassion when you needed it most. I want to hear your stories too. 3 days after Sarah's case, something happened that I didn't expect. I was in my courtroom in the middle of hearing testimony when my bailiff approached the bench. He leaned in and whispered, "Judge, there's a woman in the hallway asking to see you. Says her name is Rose Mitchell. She says she's Sarah's grandmother." I felt my heart skip a beat. Rose was here? How was that possible? From what Sarah had described, I didn't think her grandmother was capable of leaving the house, let alone coming to the courthouse. I said to the bailiff, "Tell her I'll see her during the next recess. Give me 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes felt like an hour. I tried to focus on the case in front of me, but my mind was elsewhere. What was Rose doing here? Was something wrong? Had something happened to Sarah? Finally, I called a recess and hurried to my chambers. And there she was. Rose Mitchell was sitting in a wheelchair just outside my office. I could see immediately the effects of her stroke. The right side of her face drooped slightly. Her right arm lay motionless in her lap. But her eyes were bright and alert and filled with determination. Next to her stood Sarah, looking nervous and apologetic. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, this is unexpected. Please come in." Sarah wheeled her grandmother into my chambers, and I closed the door behind us. I pulled up a chair so I could sit at eye level with Rose. I said, "How can I help you today?" Rose looked at me with those clear eyes, and when she spoke, her words were slightly slurred, but perfectly understandable. She said, "Your Honor, I had to come here. I had to meet the man who showed my granddaughter such kindness. Sarah told me what you did, what you said, the money you gave us, and I needed to look you in the eye and say thank you." I felt emotion welling up in my chest again. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you didn't need to come all this way. I know this must have been difficult for you." She shook her head slowly. "No, I did need to come. You see, Your Honor, for 6 months I felt like a burden. I felt like I've ruined my granddaughter's life. She gave up everything to take care of me, her job, her friends, her future. I've wanted to die, if I'm being honest. I've prayed to die so she could be free." Sarah gasped. "Grandma, no, don't say that." But Rose continued looking at me the whole time. Then Sarah came home from court and told me what happened. She told me what you said about character, about sacrifice, about doing the right thing. And for the first time in 6 months, I felt like maybe I'm not just a burden. Maybe what's happening between us, this care she's giving me, maybe it means something bigger than just one old woman's broken body. I had to swallow hard to keep my composure. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you are not a burden. You raised an extraordinary young woman. You gave her values that most people never learn: compassion, selflessness, love. Those things don't come from nowhere. She learned them from you. Everything she's doing now, she's doing because of how you raised her." Rose's eyes filled with tears. She reached out with her left hand, the one that still worked, and grabbed mine. She said, "You gave me something yesterday, Your Honor. You gave me back my dignity. You reminded me that I matter, not because of what I can do anymore, but because of who I am, because of the relationship I have with my granddaughter. Thank you for that gift." I held her hand and I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you've given me a gift too. You've reminded me why I do this job. It's not just about enforcing laws. It's about seeing people, understanding people, recognizing that sometimes the most important thing I can do is show someone that they're valued, that they're seen, that they matter." We sat there for a moment, the three of us, in the quiet of my chambers. Sarah was crying, Rose was crying, and I'll admit it, I was too. These were the moments that nobody sees, the moments that don't happen in open court, the moments that remind us we're all human, all connected, all trying to do our best with the circumstances we're given. Before they left, Rose said one more thing. She said, "Your Honor, my granddaughter's going back to school in the fall. I'm making her. She wants to be a nurse. She wants to help people the way the nurses helped me in the hospital. And she will, because she has a heart like yours, a heart that sees people who are suffering and can't help but reach out." I looked at Sarah, who was shaking her head. Grandma, we talked about this. I can't leave you. Rose turned to her granddaughter with more strength in her voice than I'd heard yet. Yes, you can. We'll figure it out. We'll get home care. We'll make it work. But you are not giving up your dreams for me. Not anymore. Not after what Judge Caprio showed us about the importance of character and purpose. I watched this exchange between grandmother and granddaughter, and I realized something. My small act of kindness had created a ripple effect I never anticipated. It had changed something fundamental in their relationship. It had given Rose permission to stop feeling guilty. It had given Sarah permission to still have dreams. It had reminded both of them that sacrifice is noble, but so is living your own life. You know, this is exactly why I still put on these robes every morning after 40 years, for moments like these, when justice actually works the way it's supposed to. If that means something to you, if you believe in that, show me by hitting that like button and subscribing. Let me know I'm not alone in believing this stuff matters. After Rose and Sarah left my chambers that day, I sat alone for a long time. I thought about the power we have as judges, as people in positions of authority. We can use that power to punish, to enforce rules without regard for circumstances, or we can use it to uplift, to recognize, to affirm human dignity. Both approaches are legal, both are within our rights, but only one feels right in my soul. That evening I told Joyce about Rose's visit. She cried when I described Rose saying she had wanted to die. She smiled when I told her about Sarah going back to school, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "You know what you did, Frank? You didn't just dismiss a ticket. You gave them hope. You reminded them that people can be good, that the system can work, that compassion still exists. That's worth more than any fine you could have collected." She was right. The $250 that ticket would have brought into the city's coffers meant nothing compared to what that interaction had given to two people who desperately needed to be reminded of their worth. That's the calculus we should be using in our justice system, but too often we don't. Too often we focus on the letter of the law and forget about the human beings standing before us. Now, I want to tell you what happened in the months after that, because Sarah and Rose's story didn't end in my courtroom that day. It was just beginning. About 6 weeks after the case was dismissed, I received a letter at the courthouse. It was addressed to me personally. When I opened it, I saw it was from Sarah. She wrote to tell me that her grandmother's handicapped permit had finally arrived. She sent me a photocopy of it, and she'd written on the copy, "Thank you for believing us." She also wrote that she'd enrolled in the nursing program at Rhode Island College. She was starting in the fall. She'd found a home health aide who could stay with her grandmother during class hours, paid for partly by a state program she'd finally connected with after months of trying. The letter continued, and this part really got to me. Sarah wrote, "Your Honor, I've been thinking a lot about what you said in court that day, about character mattering more than anything else. I've realized that taking care of my grandmother isn't holding me back from my life. It is my life. It's the thing I'll be most proud of when I'm old, and it's teaching me how to be the kind of nurse I want to be, the kind who sees patients as people, not just conditions. The kind who understands that behind every medical chart is a human story. Thank you for helping me see that. I must have read that letter 5 times. I kept it in my desk drawer, and sometimes when I had a particularly frustrating day, when I'd seen too many people trying to game the system or showing no remorse for their actions, I'd pull out Sarah's letter and read it again. It reminded me that the good ones are out there, the people of character, the people who make this world a better place just by being in it. Christina noticed the letter in my drawer one day. She said, "That's from the grandmother case, isn't it?" I nodded. "That girl, Sarah, she's going to nursing school." Christina smiled. "Of course she is. People like that. They don't let circumstances defeat them. They just keep pushing forward. That's what real strength looks like." Several months went by. Fall turned to winter. I continued with my daily routine. Same drive to the courthouse. Same coffee. Same dedication to seeing the people who came before me as human beings first, defendants second. I thought about Sarah and Rose occasionally, wondered how they were doing, hoped they were managing okay. Then in December, About 8 months after the original case, something extraordinary happened. I was invited to speak at the Rhode Island College Nursing Program's annual scholarship banquet. They wanted me to talk about compassion in public service, about how future nurses could bring humanity into their medical practice. I agreed because I believe deeply in that message. The night of the banquet, I arrived at the hotel ballroom where it was being held. There were about 200 people there, nursing students, faculty, donors, families. I was sitting at the head table, looking over my notes for the speech I was about to give, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Your Honor?" I turned around, and there was Sarah Mitchell. She was wearing her nursing student uniform, white and crisp and professional. She looked different than she had in my courtroom, more confident, more rested. She was smiling. "Your Honor, I can't believe you're here," she said. I stood up and shook her hand. "Miss Mitchell, how wonderful to see you. How's school going? How's your grandmother?" She beamed at me. "School is hard but amazing. I love it. I love everything I'm learning. And Grandma is stable. We have help now, which makes everything so much more manageable. I can focus on my studies without worrying every second about whether she's okay." She paused and then said, "Actually, Grandma's here tonight. She insisted on coming. Do you want to say hello?" I followed Sarah to a table near the back of the room, and there was Rose. She was still in her wheelchair, but she looked better than when I'd seen her in my chambers. More color in her face, more life in her eyes. When she saw me, she lit up. "Judge Caprio," she said, her words still slightly slurred but full of warmth. "I can't believe our luck that you're speaking tonight. We talked for a few minutes catching up on their lives. Rose told me about the home health aide, a wonderful woman from Haiti who had become like family to them. Sarah told me about her favorite classes, about how much she loved learning anatomy and patient care. They both told me multiple times that none of this would have been possible without what happened in my courtroom that day, without the fine being dismissed, without the money I'd given them, without the words of encouragement and recognition. I told them what I truly believed. I said, "You two did this, not me. I just opened a door. You walked through it. You did the hard work. You made the sacrifices. You earned this. Don't give me credit for your own strength and determination. But before I tell you what happened during my speech that night, let me ask you this. Do you think one person can really change another person's life? Or do people change their own lives and we just provide opportunities? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. When it was time for my speech, I walked up to the podium and looked out at all those young nursing students, the future caregivers of our community. I had prepared remarks about compassion and service, about seeing patients as whole human beings rather than just symptoms and diagnoses. But standing there, looking at Sarah sitting next to her grandmother in the back of the room, I decided to go off script. I said, "I was planning to give you a speech tonight about compassion in healthcare, about the importance of treating every patient with dignity. But instead, I'm going to tell you a story about a young woman who showed me what compassion really looks like. And I told them about Sarah. I didn't use her last name, but I described the case. The parking ticket, the stroke victim grandmother, the 2 jobs, the sacrifice, the character. I told them about dismissing the case and why. I told them about what I saw in Sarah that day in my courtroom, the same thing I see in the best nurses I've ever encountered. The ability to put someone else's needs above your own, the strength to do what's right even when it's hard, the compassion to see suffering and respond with action rather than just sympathy. As I spoke, I watched the audience. They were completely engaged, leaning forward, hanging on every word. And then I said something I hadn't planned. I said, "That young woman I'm describing is in this room tonight. She's one of your classmates. She's sitting right there." And I pointed to Sarah. Every head in that room turned to look at her. Sarah's face went bright red. She looked mortified. But then something beautiful happened. The entire room stood up and applauded, 200 people giving her a standing ovation, her fellow students, her professors, the donors, and families. everyone recognizing in that moment the extraordinary character that had brought her to that room. Sarah was crying. Rose was crying. And I'll be honest, I was fighting tears too. This was why I did what I did, not for recognition or praise, but for this, for the moment when goodness gets acknowledged, when sacrifice gets honored, when character gets celebrated. After the speech, after the banquet ended, the dean of the nursing school approached me. She said, "Judge Caprio, that was one of the most moving speeches we've ever had at this event." And I had no idea that was Sarah's story. She's one of our best students, top of her class. Everyone loves her. Now I understand why. She's not just learning to be a nurse. She already is one in every way that matters. The dean continued. She said, "We have a scholarship fund that provides full tuition to one nursing student each year. It's based on academic merit and strength of character. We were planning to announce the winner tonight, but after hearing your speech, after learning about Sarah's circumstances, the selection committee wants to meet first thing Monday morning. I think you may have just identified our scholarship recipient." I felt a surge of hope. I said, "That would be extraordinary. That young woman deserves every opportunity." The dean nodded. "I agree completely. We'll be in touch with her next week." I didn't tell Sarah about that conversation. I didn't want to get her hopes up in case it didn't work out, but I prayed that it would. I prayed that this young woman who had given up so much would receive something back, not because she needed it to keep going. She'd proven she would persist regardless, but because goodness should be rewarded, because the universe should recognize and honor sacrifice. The following Tuesday, Christina buzzed my chambers. She said, "Judge, Sarah Mitchell is on the phone for you. Should I put her through?" My heart started racing. I said yes. When I heard Sarah's voice, she was crying so hard she could barely speak. She said, "Your Honor, I don't know what you did. I don't know what you said. But the nursing school just called. I got the full scholarship. Full tuition for the next 3 years. Everything paid for. I can't believe it. I just can't believe this is real." I felt joy flooding through me. I said, "Sarah, you earned that. Do you hear me? You earned every penny of that scholarship through your character, your dedication, your grades, and your heart. They didn't give it to you out of pity. They gave it to you because you're exactly the kind of nurse this world needs." She was still crying. She said, "I keep thinking about that morning in your courtroom. If you had just fined me like you were supposed to, if you hadn't listened to my story, if you hadn't seen me as a person instead of just a case number, none of this would have happened. I would have paid that fine somehow. I would have kept struggling. I might have given up on school entirely, but you changed everything." I said to her, "Sarah, listen to me carefully. I didn't change anything. I just recognized what was already there. Your character, your strength, your compassion. Those things existed before you walked into my courtroom. They'll exist long after. I just held up a mirror so you could see yourself the way I saw you, the way everyone who knows you sees you." We talked for a few more minutes. She told me she was going to take her grandmother out to dinner to celebrate. She told me that Rose was doing better, more stable, more accepting of her limitations. She told me she'd been thinking about specializing in neurology nursing, working with stroke victims, because of everything she'd learned caring for her grandmother. Before we hung up, she said, "Your Honor, I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to pay forward what you did for me. Every patient I treat, I'm going to see them the way you saw me, as a whole person, as someone with a story, as someone worthy of compassion. That's my promise to you." And I believed her. I knew she would keep that promise because that's who she was. Character doesn't change, it just gets stronger. You know, you and I, we're building something here. A community of people who believe in real justice. People who understand that character matters more than money. If that's you, if you want to be part of this, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments about someone who showed you compassion when you needed it most. Now let me tell you about one more thing that happened. About a year after all of this, I was in my courtroom on a regular Thursday morning. I was hearing cases as usual when Christina called a familiar name, Sarah Mitchell. I looked up in confusion. Why was Sarah back in my courtroom? Had something gone wrong? But when I saw her walk in, I realized immediately this wasn't a defendant appearing for a case. She was in her full nursing student uniform and she was smiling, Behind her walked 12 other nursing students, all in their uniforms as well. I said, "Miss Mitchell, what's going on?" She walked up to the bench and said, "Your Honor, I hope you don't mind the interruption. My class wanted to do something special. We're studying healthcare law this semester, learning about the intersection of medical care and the legal system. And I told them about my experience in your courtroom, about how you saw me as a person first, how you understood that sometimes compassion is just as important as law. They wanted to meet you. They wanted to observe your courtroom to see justice with humanity in action." I was completely surprised, but deeply touched. I said, "Of course they can observe. They're welcome any time." And for the next 2 hours, those nursing students sat in my courtroom and watched me work. They saw me hear cases. They watched me ask questions, listen to stories, try to understand context before making decisions. They saw me dismiss some charges and uphold others. They saw me be stern when people showed no remorse and compassionate when people were genuinely struggling. After court adjourned, the nursing students came up to talk with me. They asked questions about how I decide cases, about how I balance law with humanity, about how I've managed to maintain compassion after 40 years of seeing human problems every single day. I answered as honestly as I could. I told them the same thing I'm telling you right now. I said, "I'm no saint. I'm just a man who was taught by his father that how you treat people matters more than almost anything else in life. I see people who come before me at their worst moments, their most vulnerable times. My job isn't to kick them when they're down. My job is to uphold the law, yes, but also to see them, to recognize their humanity, to understand that behind every violation is a human story." One of the students asked me, "But Judge, don't people take advantage of that compassion? Don't they lie to get out of fines?" I nodded. Yes, they do. Some of them do. And I'm not naive. I can usually tell when someone is being genuine and when someone is trying to manipulate me. But here's what I've learned. I'd rather be fooled occasionally by someone who's lying than harden my heart and miss the chance to help someone who's genuinely in need. I'd rather err on the side of compassion. Sarah stood there listening with tears in her eyes. After the other students left, she stayed behind. She said, "Your Honor, when I graduate next year, when I'm working as a nurse, I'm going to remember this day. I'm going to remember that even when you're in a position of power, even when you have every right to be cynical, you can choose compassion. You can choose to see people's humanity. That's the kind of nurse I want to be." I looked at this remarkable young woman who I'd first met when she was drowning in circumstances beyond her control, and now here she was, confident, educated, full of purpose and direction. I said, "Sarah, you already are that kind of nurse. You were from the moment you chose to care for your grandmother instead of abandoning her to her fate. Everything else is just training and certification. The heart of a healer was already in you." Let me stop here for a moment and ask you something. Do you think our justice system has room for compassion? Or should laws be enforced rigidly without exception? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Leave me a comment because I read every single one. And if you believe compassion has a place in justice like I do, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. I want to tell you what I learned from Sarah's case because it changed me as a judge and as a person. I learned that the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are sometimes different things. The letter of the law said Sarah violated a parking ordinance. The spirit of the law, the reason handicapped parking exists, is to help people with disabilities access the care and services they need. Sarah wasn't violating the spirit of that law. She was fulfilling it by getting her disabled grandmother to medical care. I learned that circumstances matter enormously. Two people can commit the exact same violation for completely different reasons. One person might park in a handicapped spot out of laziness or entitlement. Another might do it out of desperate necessity. The action is the same. The context is completely different. If we don't take time to understand context, we're not delivering justice. We're just processing paperwork. I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a person in authority can do is simply recognize someone's character. I didn't give Sarah much that day, $250 she wouldn't have to pay, $300 in cash, and some words of recognition. But those small things changed her entire trajectory. They gave her hope when she was running out of hope. They reminded her that her sacrifice mattered, that someone saw what she was doing. Never underestimate the power of being seen. I learned that my father was right about everything. How you treat people, especially when they're vulnerable, tells the world who you really are. I think about my father every single day I'm on this bench. I ask myself, would he be proud of how I handled that case? Would he approve of that decision? And with Sarah, I know he would have been proud. I know he would have done exactly what I did, probably more. I learned that character is real, and it matters more than anything else. In a world that often seems to reward selfishness and punish selflessness, it's easy to become cynical. It's easy to think that nice people finish last, that sacrifice is for suckers. But then you meet someone like Sarah, and you're reminded that character is its own reward. That doing the right thing creates a life worth living. That integrity and compassion aren't weaknesses. They're the greatest strengths a human being can possess. Now 3 years have passed since Sarah first walked into my courtroom. 3 years since that morning when I saw a tired young woman carrying a manila envelope and the weight of the world on her shoulders. And let me tell you how her story ends, because you deserve to know. Because stories of goodness should have endings that restore your faith in humanity. Last month I received an invitation in the mail. Sarah Mitchell was graduating from nursing school. The ceremony was at the Rhode Island Convention Center. The invitation had a personal note attached. It said, "Your Honor, I would be deeply honored if you would attend my graduation. You're the reason I'm graduating at all. You're the reason I believed I could do this. Please come if you can. It would mean the world to me and Grandma." Of course I went. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Joyce came with me. We sat in the audience with hundreds of other families, all there to celebrate their graduating nurses. When they called Sarah's name, when she walked across that stage to receive her diploma, I stood up and applauded louder than anyone. I was so proud of her, so deeply, profoundly proud. But that's not the end of the story. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Sarah found me in the crowd and brought me over to meet someone. She said, "Your Honor, I want you to meet my grandmother." I looked over and there was Rose, still in her wheelchair, but smiling so wide her face could barely contain it. Rose grabbed my hand with her working hand and said, "Judge, my granddaughter is a nurse. Can you believe it? After everything we went through, after all those dark days, she's a nurse. And it's because of you, because you saw her heart." I shook my head. "No, Mrs. Mitchell, it's because Sarah has the strongest character of anyone I've ever met. I just got out of her way and let her shine. Sarah told me she'd already accepted a job at Rhode Island Hospital in the neurology unit. She was going to work with stroke patients, people just like her grandmother. She was going to use everything she'd learned, not just in school, but in those hard months of caring for Rose, to help other families navigate the same journey. Can you imagine how perfect that is? How perfectly her pain was transforming into purpose. And Rose was doing well. The stroke had left permanent damage, yes, but she'd adapted. She'd accepted her new reality. More importantly, she'd stopped seeing herself as a burden and started seeing herself as Sarah's inspiration. Sarah told me that her grandmother talks to every nursing student who comes to visit, telling them about the importance of family caregivers, about the view from the patient's perspective, about what it means to maintain dignity in the face of physical limitation. Before I left the reception that day, Sarah gave me a gift. It was a framed photograph of her in her nursing uniform, standing next to her grandmother's wheelchair. Rose was holding Sarah's diploma. Both of them were smiling. On the frame, Sarah had engraved words that made my eyes blur with tears. It said, "To Judge Frank Caprio, who taught me that compassion is the highest form of justice. With eternal gratitude, Sarah and Rose Mitchell." That photograph sits on my desk in my chambers now, right where I can see it every day, When I'm tired, when I'm frustrated, when I'm dealing with someone who shows no remorse and no character, I look at that picture. I remember that the good ones are out there, that my compassion might be wasted on 9 people, but the 10th person, the Sarah Mitchell, she makes it all worthwhile. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too soft on Sarah that day? Should I have just enforced the law as written and collected the fine? Or do you think I did the right thing by looking at her circumstances and her character? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Tell me in the comments. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or followed the law to the letter? Would you have taken the time to listen to her story? Or would you have just moved through the case quickly to get to the next one on the docket? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. Your perspective matters to me. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice and compassion like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Someone who's struggling, someone who's sacrificing for others, someone who needs to be reminded that character matters, that goodness gets recognized eventually, that compassion still exists in this world. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. It's about a homeless veteran who taught me about honor. You'll want to see that one. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. Until then, remember that every person who stands before you, whether in a courtroom or in line at the grocery store or anywhere else, they have a story. They have struggles you can't see. They have burdens you can't imagine. How you treat them in that moment, that says everything about who you are. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. But more than that, we're all equal in our humanity. We all deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity and respect. Thank you for listening to my story about Sarah and Rose Mitchell. Thank you for caring about justice with compassion. Thank you for believing that character matters more than circumstances. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. Kindness costs nothing, but it changes everything. And seeing someone's humanity, really seeing them, that costs nothing at all, but it might save their life. Take care of each other out there. See each other. Help each other. And never forget that the smallest act of compassion can create ripples that spread further than you'll ever know. That parking ticket I dismissed. Those few $100s I gave Sarah, those words of recognition I offered, they rippled out into a career of healing, into thousands of patients who will be cared for by a nurse with extraordinary compassion, into a grandmother who found meaning in her suffering, into a story that I hope inspires you to look for opportunities to show compassion in your own life. That's the power we all have, not just judges, all of us. Every single day we have opportunities to see people, to recognize their struggles, to offer kindness when they expect judgment. That's how we change the world, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of compassion multiplied across millions of human interactions. Be the person who sees, be the person who cares, be the person who makes someone else's day a little bit better just because you cross their path. That's what I try to do from my bench. That's what Sarah does every day in her nursing care. That's what I hope you'll do in whatever role you play in this world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these stories and these lessons. You're the reason I keep sharing them. You're the reason this work continues to matter. Until next time, go out there and be someone's blessing today. Be someone's moment of compassion. Be someone's reason to believe that people are still good.